Hey everyone, it's Matt with Spiceworks. Thanks for joining us on another Spiceworks Partner webinar. Employees, the biggest danger to IT. Keep hires from starting fires. Brought to you by Spectresoft. First off, I'd like to remind everyone of a few things. There's a Q&A box on your screen to the bottom right. We encourage you to submit your questions at any time during the presentation. We will get to those questions at the end of the presentation via a verbal Q&A. But if your question isn't addressed live, Spectresoft will be able to follow up with you. Another thing to remember is that we are recording this webinar. So if you have to step out for a bit, it's no big deal. You'll receive a link via email to view this recording in a few days. It will be an on-demand presentation, so you can check it out as many times as you'd like. Well, that's all I have, so now it's my pleasure to introduce our presenters, Dominique Colteria, VP of Human Resources, and Mike Tierney, Chief Operating Officer, both from Spectresoft. So I'm going to hand it off to Mike and let him dive right in. Mike?
Thank you, Matt. And thanks to everyone that's joined us today. I know that everybody's busy, so we always try in these to be informative, hopefully a little bit entertaining, and hopefully you come away with some facts before we start, and it's time well spent. So with that, we'll do the obligatory quick overview of Spectresoft for those who are not familiar with us, and you can read the words up on the screen better than I can probably. Just real quickly about us, we have over 7,000 companies use our flagship product, deployments that range between the tens of seats to the tens of thousands of seats. People generally come to us because they're looking for assistance in one of three main areas. They're either concerned about productivity, investigations, or security. And we're going to focus today mainly on security. We're going to be talking a lot about understanding and dealing with risk inside of a company. I'm joined today by Dominique Colteria, and she's gonna help us walk through some of this. As a housekeeping note, I've worked with Dominique for a long time. This is not the first company we worked at together. And if there's anybody on the line who thinks that HR is not a value add to the company or can't assist the company with maintaining security, especially when dealing with insiders, this would be a good time to listen up, because I think you're going to have a different perception of what HR is and what HR can do when we're done here today. So Dominique is going to take over for me and help us walk through the employee life cycle a little bit and talk a little bit about how risk can be managed and mitigated throughout. So have at it, Dominique.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Today's topic is employees equals the biggest danger to IT, how to keep hires from starting fires. We're going to walk through the employee life cycle, and that risk is through three phases of that cycle: the beginning, the middle, and the end. So as we look, in the beginning, we have not only the pre-hire, but the post-hire, and what does that mean to all of you? One informs the other. The pre-hire is going to be your recruiting stage, and at this stage, you're not only determining what the job is, but you're determining the fit of the person to the culture, the team, and the company, as well as the position and the risk associated with that position. But before you even consider the person that you're going to be hiring or even looking at when you're recruiting, you have to consider the positions and the risks associated with them. And to determine this before you start the recruitment process, you want to do that first, and that's working with the hiring manager. Okay. When we're looking at the pre-hire, the different risk levels, we've got the funnel. We have the job description, we have the information, we have systems. The position is always defined through the job description and the requisition, and that is worked together with the hiring manager and with human resources. And at that time, we also know what the systems and the information that we need. And here's where we can actually assess the risk. For that, we also have other factors that have to be considered. 77% of employee fraud happens in 6 areas: accounting, operations, sales, customer service, purchasing, and upper management, which is the highest risk. This was determined by the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. So here we are, make it simple and a common sense approach. So with that, every position has a risk. As for example, you have a receptionist. That is your first impression in an organization. Now, if the person is on the phone, they're taking a call, they are very well aware in front of everyone that they can determine if they're delivering poor customer service. Okay, it could turn customers away and possible prospects. That's a lower risk than somebody who may have highly privileged users that may be deciding to steal. Higher risk, harder to detect. They know what they're doing.
Yeah, and I think the key point there, Dominique, that you're making is that we're talking about positional risk, right? So even though it's easy when we say, we say things like receptionist or we talk about an accountant or something like that, to picture a person, we're really talking about the position and the risk inherent in the position. We'll talk about people in a little bit. But
Mike, you're absolutely right, because a lot of times, we determine it's Susie Q or John B that may be in a position and we really like that person. But, as we'll talk further on, that sometimes we just don't know what's going on in someone's personal life, or maybe we do, and we'll talk about that risk later on. But absolutely, in the beginning, we have to determine based on the position and the risk to the organization if it's compromised. Okay? So we talk about pre-hire risk levels. The level of risk is associated with the position that helps dictate it. So these are action items that you see on your screen. We take that understanding of the risk and translate it into that action. Who's going to be involved in the screening, so during the interview process. The level of background checks, that really depends on that person's role. You may take where it's a staff level position that just requires, basic background checks, federal criminal, state level, things of that sort. But then you get into, if it's in the accounting world, where they may have fiduciary responsibility, higher risk, again, depending on the role. And then what agreements do our successful candidate, what are they going to be required to sign? Okay? But here, every company is assessing and assigning risk, whether it's formal or informally. And again, how are we doing is the real question. Are we doing it consistently? Are we documenting it? Are we communicating it? And have we translated it into action? Here we have a poll that we'd love for you to participate in. Does your company assign a formal risk rating, level, and score to all positions? We'll give everyone about 30 seconds to chime in, and we'd love to hear what your vote is.
yeah, it'll be interesting to see what people say. As you were going through the departments that employee fraud takes place in, a lot of those are departments that I work in, so I felt fairly risky while you were doing that. And we should have some results up here in a moment. It'll be interesting to see. We've done this before, and we've talked to people about this before, and you get an interesting mix. And what we're really talking about is, do you go through a process, a consistent formal process, and say this position has a risk level associated with it? Not really an informal process, but something more formal where it spits out something like a number, and we'll talk a little bit more about that.
I also think all sizes of organizations apply here, whether it's a large corporate environment with lots of different departments, or if it's a small 10-person or 15-person company. I think it certainly can be formalized and documented. It doesn't necessarily have to be informal.
Yep.
Mike, there's some results on the screen now. It says 94% say no, they don't assign formal risk scores.
Good to know. Thank you, Ezra. And that, I can't say that's too surprising. And I want to spend a little bit of time and talk about that. So let's keep moving. And let's talk about assigning a risk level to a position. And I'm going to stress that again. We're talking about positions, right? Or this term that I may or may not have made up, positional risk. This can be a very simple process, or if you want to make it a little more complicated, you can, right? A wise man that I used to work with told me once that people tend to complicate things they don't want to do. And I think that, if we look at how simple a process this can be, you'll see that this is something that you can put into practice very easily. And it's a great opportunity for HR and IT to work together. If IT is letting HR know the type of access a position needs, it can really come together in a nice way that can start an employee life cycle or the beginning life cycle of a position off on a really secure footing. And really, it can be as simple as what's up on the screen here. You take a look at the job description, as Dominique mentioned earlier. You figure out what access is that position going to need to perform its function, right, and assess the potential for damage. And there's risk associated with everybody. Then you assign a risk level. You could use a simple 1 to 10 score, or you can give it letter grades. You can give it cool code names, risk level alpha. There's all sorts of ways you can do it, but it's not that complicated to just go through all of your positions and say, all right, what are the risk levels assigned from this? And you think about the different kinds of things that insiders can do, from threats to data security out through fraud, as Dominique mentioned earlier, even inappropriate work-based behavior and the effect that that can have on a company. So you kind of run through and you spit out a number, or you spit out a letter grade or a cool code name, whatever you're using. I would suggest that every company should look to implement a process like this one. You're going to want to have key stakeholders in the room for the implementation of this process. Folks representing IT or IT security, if you're a big enough company to have kind of a line drawn there. Certainly HR, legal if you have in-house counsel. If you don't have in-house counsel, it may be a good time to have the person that does your legal work sit in on a meeting to make sure that you're defining a nice, consistent policy that doesn't run afoul of anything that you would need to worry about, labor laws and those types of things. And then certainly representation from senior management. And you can very quickly get to a point where you say, okay, we understand the risk associated with the different positions in the organization. So then let's play that forward a little bit. You've had the meeting, you've installed the process, you've assigned risk levels, so you're done. Well, not really, right? We're at the point now, we're in that beginning of the employee life cycle, but the post-hire phase. You've onboarded someone, the candidate's been screened, they've been hired. This is where IT really shines traditionally, right? They make sure that the position has the resources it needs to perform its function, and it doesn't have any extra resources that it doesn't need, right? Because we're all practicing least privilege, so that we're good, right? So systems and information are protected and secure against unauthorized access, which is great. And again, this is an area where IT and IT security traditionally really shine. The key word on this slide, however, is unauthorized, right? And we do a really good job protecting against unauthorized access, and we'll talk a little bit at the end about the amount of spend and then how that works on keeping unauthorized people out. But what about authorized access? What about the people now that you've just given access to? What do we do there, right? And the question then becomes, is hope that nothing's going to go wrong, and trust, we're going to trust our people, do those two things add up to be a viable security strategy? This is the part in the process where that positional risk and people risk start to come together. You've got this initial risk level based on the position. Now we're adding in a human element, and that's going to bring out the fact that risk can change over time. So we're going to run one more quick poll here. And the question that we have for all of you now is, do you think that once you hire somebody, you should just trust them, and they're not going to do anything to exceed or misuse the access or misuse the privileges that they've been given? So, in simple terms, once you hire people, should you just trust them? That's our poll question. And Dominique and I have had discussions about this in the past, and the example that I normally use when I talk to people about this. It's okay to trust your employees, but there are limits to how wide you give them room to use that trust. And the best example I can give you is, if you're in a company now, just go find the room in the company where everybody's personnel files are stored in a cardboard box, and the door to the room is never locked, and there's a note on the box that says, please only review your own file, right? I don't think too many of you work in that company. That would be a company that has full trust in its employees, that they're always going to do the right thing. So it's something to think about as we're going through the poll question. And then, Dominique, I had a question for you. If you went through the process and you were involved in hiring and screening an employee, or screening and hiring, I should say, and down the road that employee does something that's counter to the interests of the organization, would you regard that as a failure on your part?
No, because things change in someone's lives, whether it's their personal life or professionally that they're disgruntled. I think that we believe and, trust the fact that when we hire someone, they're fresh, they're new, we've done their reference checks, we've done their background checks, we hired the best candidate. but I believe that as time goes on, things do change in someone's lives.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very fair point. So Ezra, do we have results?
Again,
Yeah,
we
got
mirrored
results right
last
here.
results, which is 94% no.
Ah, well, we're nothing if not consistent today, which is great. All right, well, let's press on then and keep talking about, you know, how we deal with risk in the organization. Let's take a look at what some of the experts out there are saying. So, you know, the first thing I wanted to do is kind of level set now, because we're starting to transition from that positional risk and talking more about people risk, or insider risk, if you will. So the first thing up here on the screen from the great folks at Carnegie Mellon that do tremendous work in this area is the definition of an insider threat, a malicious insider threat that they use. And in effect, it's talking about authorized versus unauthorized access, or proper versus improper use of the accesses you've been given, right? You know, building on that a little bit, the good folks over at the FBI, you know, put out this statement here, and I think the key point from this, and I'm not going to go through all the words on the screen here, is that when you've granted somebody access to systems, it makes things that they're doing, if they're doing things counter to your interest, harder to detect, and it increases the damage that they can control, right? It's a lot easier to figure out that somebody that's not supposed to be getting into a system is trying to, than to figure out that somebody who is supposed to be in the system is doing something they're not supposed to. Is the layman's terms, and I'm a simple guy, I look at things in simple terms. So that's how I look at it. So, you know, the question becomes again, what do we do? You know, we talked about trust. Can we just trust? You know, and I think, you know, trust but verify. The old Russian proverb is the one to think about here. You know, another guy that I used to work with had a knack for boiling everything down into a sound bite, and he was always telling me, Mike, inspect what you expect. You know, it's one thing to tell people these are the rules and this is how we do it, but if you don't watch, things are going to go off the rails a little bit, and that can have to do with company security, or can have to do with just a regular process.
I also believe that, you know, when we're looking at the statement about being able to detect someone from the outside, internally, if that person is looking to do something that's malicious to hurt the organization, they've thought this through. This is not an impromptu, I'm just going to take the information. They've thought this through. Something has happened and changed, and they're going to be harder to detect.
Yep. No, absolutely. So let's keep pressing forward here and talk about now how we can take that risk level that we designed in that simple process we put in place earlier and translate that into action, right? So the thing to do there is to take a look at your risk levels and then make sure you have appropriate, and that's an important word, I underlined it on my slide where I have my handwritten notes, levels of scrutiny, right? Or align the amount of scrutiny you put on things to the risk level is another way of thinking about it. You know, the more access somebody has, the greater the need for review. And a monitoring plan to your risk levels, right? And there are a lot of different ways you can monitor user activity. We obviously have one that we're partial to. There are different ways of doing that. But as a general rule, high-risk positions should be actively monitored. You should have a process in place where the activity of a high-risk position or taking place in a high-risk position is reviewed, recorded, alerted on, that people are taking a look and making sure things are going right. You know, think about the things that are done in you know, privileged account management as an example. That's an area where there's a lot of scrutiny and review, and it's appropriate that there should be. And then you have you know, lower risk positions, and those can be more passively monitored. And you know, think in terms of more akin to logging there. And, you know, and this is an area that we at Spectrasoft, we spent a long time looking at this, and it was actually on a SpiceWorks webinar, well, not all that long ago, that we rolled out. You know, kind of the industry first passive employee monitoring solution. So we have options for both active and passive monitoring, right? And our goal in doing that and rolling out this passive solution was to be able to align to people's needs. So you have the active monitoring, which provides a lot of detailed and contextual information to use on high-risk positions. And then you have this more passive, more akin to activity logging solution to use on lower-risk positions. And the goal there is to enable blanket coverage of an organization, right? You don't want to be in a position where you're singling people out, and you need to acknowledge that you don't know where risk may elevate, right? So between these two flavors and these two approaches, passive and active monitoring, you can align your monitoring schema, if you will, to the risk in your company and the goals that you have for mitigating that. So that's a little bit about the beginning of the employee life cycle, and now we're going to kind of jump in and talk about the middle. And this is, typically the longest part of the employee life cycle, right? And the one that gets the least attention. There's a lot of activity at the beginning of an employee life cycle when you're provisioning and onboarding, and then there's a lot of activity when you're offboarding and deprovisioning at the end of a life cycle. But Dominique, why don't we talk a little bit about the middle, some of the reasons why risk may elevate. Once you kind of walk us through how people can deal with these things.
Okay. So the middle part, like Mike mentioned, it is a status quo that, you've done your due diligence when you've hired the person. In the end, you're offboarding, you're making sure you're going through, your termination checklist, your exit interview. But really the middle part could change at any time. We've defined the risk associated with the position, we've screened the person carefully, we've put the proper accesses in place, and we have the appropriate levels of scrutiny, which is what we just talked about. But what happens when conditions change in that person's life? HR has the opportunity to have a better understanding of what the pulse is happening of the person when their life changes. For example, if they're working closely with their manager, they have, they're clued in. Financial risk, they're going to be more apt to commit fraud if they're having financial problems at home. Security and IT may not have that insight, and that's really where the partnership with HR and IT come into play. I'm lock in step with our IT and security department. They have to be my best friend because we need to know what's going on. They may not need to know the details, and we'll talk a little bit about, assessing that risk level of 1 to 10 and being able to alert and HR being able to work together with IT and getting their help, because we do need your help. So another example is the 401k, if there's changes in it. If someone takes a hardship withdrawal, HR is aware of that. They're paying attention. I worked at one of my previous companies where we had a salesperson. HR knew he was having personal problems, and unfortunately he falsified POs. He was working with outside partners, and he hurt our organization. But by tying it together, we were able to, link everything and help stop it. But again, we take a step back and, you analyze what is going on in someone's life, because that will give you a great heartbeat to what's happening. Okay. When we talk about how insider risk turns into threat, how is that possible? Employees can be disgruntled. How? They could get a poor review. They could be on a performance plan. They may have not gotten that promotion. How about if they feel like others get preferential treatment? Or that their boss is on their case and they just can't stand it anymore. They have, professional and personal problems happening. How about if a coworker is let go? Again, they may be angry that that person was let go. But how do? We start preventing things before they begin. It is absolutely essential that we're paying attention. And when there's significant uncertainty, or how about when rumors are circulating? We all know that usually there is some ounce of truth when rumors are circulating that there's something there. And again, we have to drive, all these drives to the end of the employee life cycle, because chances are they're going to be leaving us soon, or they're going to continue being that cancer.
Yeah, and I think, one of the things that strikes me on this slide is that things like performance reviews, performance plans, which, I see them a lot in sales, but I know they take part in different parts of companies. Internal promotions, where things are celebrated. Joe got promoted, yay for Joe, but you don't realize that Steve was also up for that promotion, and now Steve's not so happy. These are everyday things inside a company, and it's interesting, to step back and think about, are these things really affecting our security internally? Do they have the potential to? And what that led me to thinking about is how you can kind of forecast your risk inside a company. And risk shifts throughout an organization regularly, and it's somewhat predictably, but not 100% so. So in that case, it's somewhat like the weather, right? But we've all gotten a weather report and headed out of the house and still ended up getting caught in the rain without an umbrella, because it's not 100% sure. But what we don't want to do in a position where we're responsible for the security of our company is get caught without a plan to deal with insider risk. Right? So let's take a look about, we're going to go back to some of the experts on the subject and hear what they have to say about how you deal with that. So, back to the great folks at SEI out in Carnegie Mellon, We got a great screenshot up here. I'd encourage everybody to go out and download this document and read it. But what they say is when you have people dealing with the types of things we just talked about on the previous slide, you want to enhance monitoring of them, right? You want to do that in a coordination, in accordance with your organization's policy, right, and obviously with laws as well. And we talked about, as you designed processes earlier, who you should have in the room, but you want to be able to turn up, have a plan for increasing that level of scrutiny as situations change. It requires preparation in advance, and that's what we've been talking about with assigning a risk level, so that you can take a look at when you have a situation like this, as Dominique talked about. HR is aware of information. You wouldn't necessarily expect the IT guy to know that someone was just put on a performance plan, and they may be very angry at the company because they know what that could mean if they don't turn it around. And a lot of times people think it's done unfairly. So if you have a position in place or you have a situation in place where HR can easily communicate, and you guys are used to working together, HR and IT, these kinds of things can be dealt with very smoothly. So we have one last poll for you. I don't know if you guys thought you'd be working this hard on this one, but one last one to talk about, and it's a really simple question. Do you alter your internal security during periods of elevated risk? So the types of things we've been talking about, where people are dealing with personnel issues, maybe getting ready to leave a company, where people could be becoming disgruntled. Do you alter your internal security? Do you enhance your scrutiny during those periods? So we'll give a couple of minutes for the answers to populate in.
One of the things that, when we talk about the reasons, how the risk turns into the threat, these different poor review performance plans, it becomes bad behavior. Our goal, in HR, that if somebody, and the managers, is that if their person's on a performance plan, that we want to turn it around and have it successful. But bad behavior can come out of it, and it's not always rosy when someone gets a promotion. I think that was a great example by Mike. And working directly with the managers, then the HR can work directly with IT and say, okay, we have X person, we've got Joan in accounting who is not happy because her friend Alice was promoted. So that we need to alert IT to say, okay, her risk has gone up because she's not happy. And it doesn't mean that she's actually going to do something, but we don't know.
Nope. That's a great point. Results, are we good?
Mike, I think these numbers are going to...
This time we have 59% of folks saying yes, they do, and 41% saying no, they don't.
Ah, interesting. I would have thought it looked a little bit more like the first two, but for the let's round it and call it 60% of you that are doing that. Well done. I think that's important.
That's great. That's impressive.
Yeah. So let's keep talking through this the middle of the employee life cycle a little bit and dealing with elevated risk.
Okay, so here's an opportunity for human resources to work with IT and security. If you don't have the relationship with your human resources department, I encourage you to reach out and develop that. We need you. In HR, I need you, especially when it comes to investigations. If someone's terminating, that's where I need your help. But so it is the entire life cycle that HR and IT should be working together. That's the interaction, and really to describe that, we have to have that communication. Assessing the risk levels, on a scale of 1 to 10, if that position has a level 5, and for example for myself, if I see that there's a threat condition that exists and it's going to be that person's normally a 5 and it may go to a 9, I'm calling my person and saying, okay, we need to elevate it to a 9 now. And they don't necessarily have to disclose details, which we as HR we don't. But from an IT standpoint, if I'm coming to my person and I tell them it's a 9, that is red alert. And having that dashboard, this can work. And then again, once the security risk has lowered, and we've been able to determine what's going on, we can revert that risk level back to a 5. But again, this is a great opportunity to work together when there is an elevated risk.
Yeah, and I think that's the key here is when you think about the types of information that HR is privy to. It's not the type of information that HR is necessarily going to want to share out throughout the company. A lot of times it's just nobody's business. right? But if you have a kind of neat packaged up way of saying, hey guys, on Joe, I need a little bit more scrutiny right now. Doesn't matter why, right? It went from a 5 to a 9, and Joe needs to know that that means I take, you know, the way we look at the actions that Joe is taking as he interacts with the resources we've granted to him, you know, from A to B in terms of what we do, and maybe we move from a passive to an active approach, or maybe we move to a more active approach where we're really looking at activity, or we're turning on different kinds of alerting so that we can see what things are going on. It really makes the process workable, and that's the key, is to put a process in place that can work and doesn't break down on you know, a communications problem. So that's a look at the middle of the employee life cycle, and we're gonna transition now, and we're gonna talk a little bit about the end. And there's a reason why we used red to kind of highlight the end of the employee life cycle. You know, this would be the place if we had background music, I would ask them to cue the ominous music now. So, you know, the term that I like to use when talking about the end of an employee's life cycle is the high-risk exit period. And the quote that's up on the screen here is from another document from the folks at Carnegie Mellon. It's called A Pattern for Increased Monitoring for IP Theft by Departing Insiders. And even though it's talking about one specific type of insider risk or insider threat, I thought it really hit home that you're looking at some very respected folks here that are telling you this is where you really have to be on extra guard.
And let's clarify, termination in the human resources world could be a resignation or it could be an actual firing. So we can use that word interchangeably for termination, that it's not necessarily somebody just being fired, but it could be them resigning and they're fed up.
Well, that's an excellent point, So let's talk about this a little bit. And you know, I said earlier I'm a simple guy, and sometimes it helps me to take things out of the IT world and think about it in other terms. So think about if you were having a party, and you're going to have that party at your house. You have a nice house, and inside your nice house you have nice things. And you're going to invite over, we'll say 10 of your friends, you know, 10 folks that you work with, whatever it might be, over to your house. And you've got things in there like grandma's china, or you know, maybe her silver. You got some old baseball cards lying around. Maybe you have some nice jewelry. Right? If you were to find out that of the 10 people that you invited to your party, 5 of them think it's okay to take a little something with them, call it a souvenir, a memento, when they leave, what would you do? I submit that you would keep a closer eye on the people with their keys in their hands. And if you are having a party on Friday night and you learned, you know, about this time, say on Thursday, that this was the situation, you'd make sure you had a plan in place, if you had the party at all. You'd make sure you had a plan in place to keep an eye on the folks that are getting ready to leave. So that applies in the corporate world as well.
I love this slide. You know why I love this slide? Because it's so simple, and when you make it this simple and then you say, well, why wouldn't we apply it the same way in business? You know, you just scratch your head saying, wow, that's what I need to do. I need to protect, because you would do that for yourself. Okay, so now we're at the end of the high-risk exit period. Okay, so we're at the end of the life cycle. How many are you surprised to hear that 1 out of 2 employees surveyed through Symantec and through another survey through Spectrasoft that they think it's okay to take corporate data with them when they leave? Okay, whether it's intentional or not intentional. 51% in one survey, the Symantec one, said that they thought it was okay, and 48% in Spectrasoft survey, which was more than 400 people surveyed. That's very scary.
Yeah, I think the other thing in that Symantec survey that jumped out at me, and we don't have it up on the screen, is 18% of people in that survey admitted, and if I could do that in all caps, they admitted to stealing corporate intelligence. And if 18% are admitting it, it's a much higher number. That was the other thing that jumped out at me.
Absolutely. Again, I think some people don't even think what they're doing. They realize that they're doing something wrong. This is the company's intellectual property. This is, you know, not for them to take. But again, that's HR working during the exit interview to identify and make sure that folks already know. You know, I don't believe we have a slide here, but there are statistics out there that will tell you folks that have given a resignation, a 2-week resignation, If you think that they're just now thinking about taking corporate information, you're too late. It's already been done, and that's where it is that if you hear rumors or that their behavior is changing, somebody who has a lot of trinkets or has family pictures up, if those are disappearing and changing, or somebody all of a sudden starts coming dressed real nice and they normally dress down, those are all signals, behavioral changes that need to be paid attention to by your HR, by your department head, by, your IT, because this is important. They've already taken your information. So here we are looking at if someone's leaving, their risk level immediately escalates to 10. And, we talked about the reason of termination. It could be resignation, or it could be by them being fired. And that rumor with the behavior changes as I just described. And really your HR department needs to be working with your hiring managers that if these things are being witnessed, that there is an issue. Okay, then we go to the exit period of where HR communicates to IT and security as soon as the resignation is received. Work together, IT folks with HR, press on your HR department to be notified as soon as possible, or even if it's suspected, that, again, the two have to work together. We're talking about our corporate information.
Yeah, and this is an area, I think the key on this slide that, this would be another interesting poll question, but I promise we're not going to make you do any more work. My experience has been that IT typically gets notified well after someone has resigned that they're going to need to turn things down. And it might be, you're talking about a 2-week notice period. They might get a week heads up. They might get 3 days heads up. Sometimes they're going to get told, oh, by the way, it was Joe's last day, right? Can you make sure he's shut off? And we really need to be doing this a lot more proactively because wackiness, badness, whatever you want to call it, occurs when people are leaving, right?
Absolutely. And for all of you out there, there should be a termination checklist. Very easy. Again, let's not complicate it. It should be a simple exit checklist that's done, so that way IT is immediately notified. And again, if a decision is made to terminate, IT and security should be notified and communicated to by HR that that decision has been made. Okay. Now, at the termination process, which is going to be during your exit interview, that's time for HR to review the confidentiality and IP agreements with the employee immediately. What are they responsible for? What are they expected? For all of you, if you don't have employee confidentiality and IP agreements in place, I strongly suggest that you do have them in place. Again, part of the initial new hire, not just with background checks, because to get it after the fact is not going to happen. But then have a termination checklist that's basically saying they've returned documents, they've returned corporate data, anything they work with. If they have source code on their laptop at home or have access, make sure that they are abiding by the non-competes, reminding them during that exit interview at that time that they need to sign this information. That's absolutely critical.
Yeah, and I think one other thing on your confidentiality and IP agreements. Sometimes these documents get a little dated, and I would glance at those. It used to be that they specified that people need to return confidential information, but as everything became digital, it really needs to say destroy, because I could certainly email back a whole bunch of stuff. I still have a copy of it. So you really want to make sure that word destroy is in your confidentiality agreements. And you want to review these, as Dominique said. But then, beyond that, you want to take a look at what people are doing. And Dominique alluded to it earlier. There's a lot of studies and models that show very conclusively that when somebody is leaving a company, if they're going to take information, they do it in the 30-day period leading up to their termination date. So it's voluntarily, if it's on their side and they're deciding to leave a company, it's going to happen probably before they give notice, but certainly before they leave the company, and more than just those last 2 weeks. If they suspect they're going to be let go, you're talking about different types of confidential information or company IP, and think about whether people have a perceived ownership stake in it. So a lot of times, I was a salesperson for a long time. You work really hard. You build up a territory. You take pride in that database of contacts that you've built up. You start to feel ownership in it. it starts to blur in your mind. Does this belong to the company or to me, or is it both of ours? So as a company, you have to decide, is it okay for your salespeople to leave with a whole bunch of information about your customers? Developers, it's another area. They write code. They put their heart and soul into writing the best code that they can. They take a lot of pride in it. There's an ownership stake in the code that they write. Again, the line blurs. It doesn't make them necessarily bad people. It's a tough call to say, I worked the last year on this stuff. That's my stuff. So you really need to make sure, remind people what they signed, but then take a look at what they're doing. Review the online activities, for the 30 days before and after notice if you can, and you probably have less than 30 days after, but if the dates are not the same, make sure you're really taking a close look at everything that's been done. You want to look at things like outbound emails, especially emails to webmail that you can't identify. You want to look for, attachments that are going out, and maybe stuff that shouldn't be getting emailed off your company. Certainly movable things to portable storage, and let's face it, portable storage now today has become a drag and drop up to a little icon that puts it in the cloud. These are all things that you want to take a close look at to make sure that important data is not leaving your company. Now, that sounds like a whole lot of work, and getting back to complicating things you don't want to do, you guys all have whiteboards that are full of things that you want to get done. And this is the kind of thing that can derail your entire week if you have to go start doing that. And, we try to make it easy for you. So what we do really quickly here at SpectraSoft is record and log employee interactions with the resources they're given. Right? And up on the screen here, you can see we can collect a whole lot of information. Now, you have options when using our software. You don't have to collect everything. We spent this entire time today talking about security and wanting to make sure that you're securing your company. There are things that our software does that are purely productivity focused. An example might be websites visited. You're not really worried about that right now. We're not worried about if they're spending too much time on Facebook and those types of things if we're talking about company security. But we are worried about things like document tracking and are things leaving my network. Are they emailing things out to webmail accounts that I can't identify that have things attached to them that they shouldn't have? So there are options within our software to decide what you want to record, but we can record all this stuff for you either passively or actively. We talked about that earlier. Passively, we're recording it and it's there if you need it. So in this case, somebody resigns, you might want to go look at that, but you might otherwise not have a need to look at it. In our passive approach, we actually store 30 days worth of data and we overwrite the 31st day. We did not arrive at that date by accident. We looked at the exit period of a company or an employee and said, if that's the time frame that we need to be reviewing, let's put a tool in place for people to be able to do that. Active monitoring, that's where we're writing it back into a secure SQL database, and people can actually get in there and look through the information and say, I'm going to go through some of these emails and I'm going to make sure that we're okay, right? So that's a little bit about the data that we collect. Now, it's okay to collect a lot of data, but if you can't use it, it's not easy to get at and get value from. It's not doing you a lot of good. We've spent a lot of time making it people to go out and see what's going on. One of the most popular features we have is this DVR style playback, right? You could effectively watch a user's activity like press and play on a DVR, right? You're basically watching a video. Very easy for non-technical resources to get in and do that if you give them access to it. You can see things in context. So you can see that somebody may be doing something that might initially not look so good, but with the context around it, it doesn't look so bad. We make it easy to pull data out of our system. We have integrations with some SIM systems. We also can just pump out in syslog if you want to put it somewhere else. We can report it out to, or export it out to just about any format you would want. We have a lot of canned reporting in there, and then the ability to go in and set a lot of alerts. And it basically help you keep an eye on the online and communications fabric of your company, where these types of things are going on that you need to be worried about or thinking about. Very quickly, on the solutions, we talked about passive and active monitoring before, just to tie those into what we offer. I mentioned earlier that we rolled out a solution. We call it Spectra 360 Recon, or just Recon. That's what we believe is the industry's first passive monitoring solution. It's what does the logging and alerting on activity, but it keeps that activity locked away unless you need it. So it really acts as an insurance policy, especially when we're talking about the end of an employee life cycle, but it can be a great early warning system as well. 2 flavors of active monitoring. Spectra 360 is an enterprise class active monitoring solution. Writes to that SQL backend that I was talking about, provides a lot of detailed contextual information. This is a great solution for those high-risk positions that you need to have, a real closer level of scrutiny on. Spectre C&E Investigator is a lighter weight version. It doesn't require the SQL backend, doesn't have a lot of dedicated infrastructure requirements. It's great for smaller businesses. Doesn't do a lot of aggregation of data, but it can really help you if you're looking at individuals one at a time. And then we also have a classic security and event log monitoring tool with a couple other bells and whistles rolled on it. That's called Server Manager. We're very active in the Spiceworks forums. There's a lot of discussion on that product in particular. And I believe one of our SEs just won an award out at the Spiceworks conference recently, and we're pretty proud of him for that. That was Jack Doyle, and some of you guys might have had a chance to meet him if you were down there. So that's a quick overview of kind of how we can help with these types of situations and what our solutions look like. So, I want to leave you with some thoughts about what you should do next. And Dominique actually brought back to me from an HR conference some great information, and that's what you're looking at here on the slide right now. So the first thing I would say in terms of what you should do next is just be aware, right? Be aware of a lot of things that we talked about here today. There's some great information on this slide. I apologize, it's a lot of words. But 70% of the value of a business held within information systems. That number jumped out at me. Massive numbers, pulled from various industry sources about the amount of damage in terms of losses due to trade secret theft annually. And we could probably do a whole other webinar on trade secret at some point. And then these last three bullets came from a guy named Dan Smartwood. He was testifying in front of Congress. He was the Director of Information Safeguarding at Walt Disney Corporation. I think he had a similar role at Compaq before that. And we talked about earlier that keeping authorized access versus unauthorized access, really only a tiny bit is spent on dealing with making sure insiders are behaving in the best interest of the company. Very little is done to protect proprietary information against whether it's untrained, inadvertent type losses, or what we've talked a lot about here today, disgruntled employees. And I think that that's something that needs to be thought about, because you can, the media is littered with stories of insider risk that has turned to insider threat and damaged companies. So a couple of things to think about there, and then we wanted to leave you with some helpful things. At least we hope they're helpful. So in terms of what you should do next, you can go to the URL that's up on the screen here, and we've got some great free resources for you. So Dominique mentioned earlier having some checklists and things like that available to help you go through that employee end of the life cycle in a little more orderly and planned way. We've got a best practices package up there for you. It includes some base checklists and things that you can build off of. That's a great thing to do there. We have a white paper that kind of walks you through the steps. If you want to take a look at it, implementing an employee monitoring program, it'll talk a little bit more about active and passive and the types of things you want to consider. You can certainly download trials of our active and passive monitoring solutions. And then we're offering everybody that's attending here today, you have to be live on the webinar, 2 free 60-day license of Spectre C&E Investigator. Leave your company. We wanted to give you some tools. If you suspect somebody may be getting ready to leave, maybe you have somebody that's going through some of those personnel issues, we wanted to give you an opportunity to apply a tool and actually take a look at what's going on in there, because the statistics show a high likelihood that you may have an issue going on there. So that's the information we had prepared for you today. I think we're doing pretty good on time, and we probably have time for a couple of questions. For those of you that aren't sticking around for the questions, I want to thank you again for all the time that you've given us today, and hopefully this was beneficial to you. But Matt, did you have any questions from the audience?
Yeah, we got a couple rolling in here. I do want to encourage everyone, if you have a question, just please log it into that Q&A window there, and we'll get it over to Mike and Dominique. But first off, are there organizations that have risk level designations in place based on job roles?
Well, that's a good question, and the answer is yes. And we've started talking about this, so hopefully the answer is growing too, the number of companies. But I can tell you there are absolutely organizations, and this is an area where the government has actually done a really good job. So I've seen documents from different government agencies that outline, very similar to what we're talking about. Of course, we're talking about the government, so they can turn, a single slide with a 4-step process into a 78-page document. But, processes to go in and assess the risk available for, and make sure that that risk level is understood and there are plans for dealing with it. So I've seen that in a couple of different places. It's a good question, Matt.
Great. Another one we got here. Can you predefine monitoring policies in your products? So if an employee just resigned, you can monitor them more closely.
Yeah, another good question. And yes, the answer to that is you can. You can set up a, call it a recording profile, if you will, and that would, if you remember a couple slides ago, we talked about the different information that we record or can record. So you can go through and have different profiles set up that has a different amount of information being captured. It can increase the frequency that screenshots are taken on, so that video becomes more all-encompassing, as an example. It can have different alerting policies set into it, so you can build those, and you can actually go through and have risk level 5, risk level 9, so that when that call comes, you just go, okay, I got to switch from this policy to that policy, and I'm off to the races. So short answer is yes.
I would certainly have that in place prior to something actually happening. I think a lot of times, people have knee-jerk reactions or are reactive versus being proactive.
Great. Moving right along, you were saying these are common issues. Have either of you been in a situation where departing employees caused a company harm?
Actually, I'll take that. That's a great question. Yes, I've actually had, again, at one of my previous companies, we had a sales rep in EMEA that was leaving the organization, and after the fact, we got a call from one of our partners / resellers that was attending a show that she was attempting to sell off of a thumb drive our data, our information. And that was pretty scary, and thankfully we had a great relationship with this partner, but it could have done severe financial harm to our organization if this list had gotten out. And we actually ended up, contacting the local police, where we ended up getting the thumb drive back. But again, it's one of those things that if we had had that product, back then, how great would that have been, because we would have seen what she was doing on her system to show that she was taking this data. So yes, I have encountered that.
Yeah, and I've seen it as well. And again, the size of the company doesn't really matter here. And one of the instances, it wasn't actually a place that I was, but I have a relative who's an accountant. He has a small practice. He's very successful, but kind of a small office. He's got a few employees, and he had a bookkeeper leave pleasantly, no animosity. And she went, unbeknownst to him, to another accounting firm in the same town, and it's maybe an 80,000 person town, something like that. And because my relative is very good at what he does, and he's got a great relationship with his clients, he started getting calls from his customers saying, "Hey, I'm just letting you know that this accounting firm across town is calling us and saying that we should move our business to them." And it didn't take him long. He got a couple of those calls in rapid fire to realize that when the bookkeeper left, she took his customer list. And that was one of the reasons they hired her. And he had to go deal with that in another way, obviously. But it certainly led him to believe that he had to keep a closer eye on certain things. This wasn't a situation. This wasn't he didn't let her go. There wasn't any animosity or whatever. It was just kind of one of those things that happens. So yeah, I think we've all seen it.
And I will tell you that the sales rep that I was referring to in EMEA did not leave on bad terms. So again, this doesn't always necessarily mean that it's someone who's been fired or who's angry with the company. It's just, this person had financial problems and was looking to make a quick buck.
Awesome. So moving right along again, we got a lot of questions coming in, so we'll try to get through some of these very quickly. First, does 360 have passive monitoring module built in within it? And does the C&E investigator have the passive monitoring as well?
Okay, so two-part question. So C&E is not. C&E is an active monitoring solution. So the answer there is no. 360 and 360 Recon work very closely together. So you'd be managing them from the same console. They share a lot of the same code, and you can transition back and forth between the passive monitoring, the Recon approach, and the active monitoring, the 360 approach, very easily. So even though we view them as very differently, they work very closely together, and it wouldn't be unfair to say that within 360 you could use either active or passive. You're dealing with a different license type at that point, and frankly, the passive approach is a lot cheaper on a per license basis than the active approach is.
Great. Next one. Can you download or save this gathered information for later review or archival purposes?
Yeah. So two ways of doing that. One, on the 360 product, you can define your own retention policies, right? So if you're writing the data back to the SQL database, you can keep that for just as long as you like. The Recon approach, the passive approach, we do overwrite data. You can store up to 30 days worth of data, right? And that was done intentionally because those are typically used for the lower risk areas. And the idea was it aligned to the kind of that risk period at the end of the life cycle, and you're typically going to be aware of things kind of within 30 days. You'll have an inkling and know I maybe need to switch this person from a passive approach to an active approach. So that passive approach does not give you the ability to retain data longer than 30 days, and that was done again intentionally. C&E, it's kind of the same. It's an active approach. We're not writing to a SQL database. We're using something a little bit more proprietary, but you can certainly archive the data just as you could archive the data out of SQL and put it into some other kind of storage if you wanted to as well.
Great. Well, I think we're kind of nearing the end of our time, so we want to be mindful of all of y'all's time for the rest of the day. So I think we'll wrap out of Q&A. I do want to thank Mike and Dominique for their great presentation today. Big hand to y'all. And I do want to thank SpectreSoft for sponsoring today's webinar. And special thanks to each and every one of you for joining us today and tuning in. I hope you got a lot of great information. And I do want to remind everyone that if you had to step out for a bit or just want to go back and rewatch today's presentation, you will be getting an email here in a couple of days with a link to view that on demand. And we did have a lot of great questions rolling in there at the end that we just didn't have time to get to. So SpectreSoft will be able to follow up with you offline if you had a question. And with that, thanks to Mike and Dominique again. And I just want to thank each and every one of you, and hope to see you again soon on another SpiceWorks webinar. But until then, I hope everyone has a great afternoon.
Thank you.